Have you ever found yourself just standing in front of the open refrigerator at midnight, staring blankly at, like, a block of cheese?
Oh, absolutely.
And you genuinely have no memory of actually walking into the kitchen. You're just suddenly there holding the cheese.
Yeah, the classic sleepwalk snack. It's a bizarrely universal human experience, usually followed by the immediate realization that you weren't even actually hungry.
Right. I do it, well, way more often than I'd like to admit. Or, think about your inbox.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, you hear that little sharp ding, or you see the Slack notification pop up on the corner of your screen. And before you even process the name of the sender, this immediate wave of tight, suffocating anxiety just washes over your chest.
I like the physical reaction.
Exactly. It feels completely physiological, like it's totally out of your conscious control. It basically feels like your nervous system is running a shadow government entirely without your permission.
That is the absolute definition of being stuck on autopilot. I mean, we all have these highly automated loops where our behaviors and our physiological reactions feel fundamentally hardwired into our architecture.
And that feeling of being permanently hardwired is, well, that's what we are unpacking today. I was looking through our research notes for today, specifically a brief called The Rewired Mind, and it completely reframes this entire experience of feeling stuck in our habits.
It really does.
It's this deep dive into both the hard science and the everyday application of neuroplasticity. And really, the mission for our deep dive today is to understand the actual mechanics of why our brains get so stubbornly locked onto that autopilot setting and, discover how to force a manual override to physically change the structural topography of the brain.
Right, the actual physical structure.
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack this, because the first major takeaway from the text requires a pretty fundamental paradigm shift. For decades, the cultural and even scientific assumption was that the adult brain was a finished product.
Like it was done baking.
Right, like a beautiful porcelain vase that goes into a kiln, gets fired, and once it's set, it's just rigid forever. But the reality outlined in our sources is that the brain isn't porcelain at all. It is much more like wet clay or Play-Doh, just constantly being molded.
And, to appreciate how radical that shift is, you really have to look at the medical history. Because for a very long time, the overwhelming consensus in neurology was that the adult brain was definitively fixed.
Wow, definitively.
Oh, yeah. The running theory was that neurogenesis and neural development basically ground to a halt around age 25.
Just stopped entirely.
Right. The idea was you had your hardware, your temperament, your ingrained coping mechanisms, and, well, that was it. You were stuck occupying whatever neural real estate you had managed to build up through adolescence.
Which is an incredibly deterministic, almost fatalistic way to look at human biology.
It really is.
I mean, if you were highly reactive or anxious at 25, the medical consensus was basically, well, that's your operating system now. Learn to manage the symptoms because you just can't rewrite the code.
It was incredibly grim. But the discovery of neuroplasticity completely shattered that. We now know the brain is fiercely dynamic.
Fiercely dynamic, I like that.
Yeah, it is constantly remodeling its own physical structure based on your environment, your experiences, and most importantly, your repeated behaviors.
Okay, so if we are tossing out the porcelain vase theory, how does this remodeling actually work on a cellular level? Like, what is the physical mechanism that makes the wet clay move?
Right, so that brings us to Donald Hebb's foundational rule of neuroscience, which is often referred to as Hebb's law.
Okay.
The shorthand for it is basically neurons that fire together, wire together.
Neurons that fire together, wire together. We hear that phrase a lot, actually. But the source material uses this brilliant jungle path analogy to illustrate the actual physics of this, which I found super helpful.
It's a great visualization.
Yeah, so imagine your brain's neural network is this massive, incredibly dense, overgrown jungle. The first time you execute a new behavior, let's say you decide to check your email, the absolute millisecond your eyes open in the morning, it's like you are hacking your way through that thick underbrush with a dull machete.
It takes effort.
Exactly.
Okay.
The electrical signal is slow. It takes conscious effort, and the pathway it leaves behind is super messy.
But the next morning, you do it again.
Yeah.
You force the electrical signal down that exact same route.
Right. And every single time you repeat that specific action, you are walking down that exact same jungle path. But it's not just a metaphor, right? Biologically, you are triggering glial cells to start wrapping those specific axons in myelin.
Exactly. You are literally insulating the circuit.
You're clearing out the brush, stomping down the dirt, and eventually, after weeks of this morning email habit, that messy little machete path turns into a smooth dirt road.
And then a highway.
Yeah. Keep going. And it turns into a fully paved, multi-lane asphalt highway. The brain recognizes the frequency of the route and physically optimizes it to make the electrical journey fast, smooth, and metabolically effortless.
That's the key right there. Your nervous system is absolutely obsessed with conserving metabolic energy.
Because the brain uses so much energy, right?
Exactly. The brain consumes a massive amount of our daily caloric intake, so it aggressively seeks efficiency. Anything it can shift from conscious energy-intensive thought into a paved, low-energy autopilot highway, it will.
Okay, let me take that a step further because this highlights the darker side of neural efficiency.
Oh, absolutely.
If I am continuously stressing over interpersonal conflicts, like if I predictably assume the absolute worst-case scenario every time my manager asks for a quick sync, I am not just having a fleeting thought, am I? I am physically laying down asphalt on a worry highway.
What's fascinating here is that you are quite literally engaged in heavy construction on your own gray matter. Yet when you obsessively ruminate, you are actively strengthening the synaptic bonds in the circuits associated with hypervigilance and fear.
So it just gets easier to panic.
Exactly. The electrical signals traverse those insulated, myelinated pathways faster and faster, making it exponentially easier for your brain to default to that exact anxious route the next time a trigger appears.
I'm building an 8-lane Autobahn for my own anxiety without even realizing I'm operating the paving machine.
We all are, unfortunately. But the architecture of the brain is a two-way street, which brings us to the hopeful flip side of Hebb's law, which is synaptic pruning.
Right, pruning.
Yeah, if neurons that fire together wire together, then circuits that are ignored begin to physically degrade.
The source notes describe this as the jungle naturally reclaiming the unused path, but the biology behind it is just wild.
It really is.
If you actively stop indulging that morning email grab, you aren't just forgetting a habit. Your brain realizes that specific synaptic connection isn't firing anymore. It stops insulating it.
And then the cleanup crew arrives.
Yeah, eventually the brain sends in immune cells microglia to literally eat or phagocytose, those unused synaptic connections.
It is a ruthless system of resource management. The brain simply cannot afford to maintain high-speed highways that nobody's driving on.
So it just tears them up.
It tears up the asphalt to repurpose those proteins and energy elsewhere. Rewiring your mind is equally about learning new behaviors and actively starving old pathways so the microglia can dismantle them.
Okay, understanding the biological necessity of starving those old pathways is great in theory.
Sure.
But let's look at the actual reality of human behavior here. When I hear that Slack notification ding, the urge to jump on that fully paved, highly efficient panic highway is immediate.
Instantaneous.
Yeah, the electrical signal is already halfway down the road before I even consciously register what's happening. The microglia haven't dismantled the road yet, so how do I actually stop myself from driving on it?
You need a manual override. Because your brain heavily biases toward the efficiency of those established highways, you have to introduce friction. The source material outlines a specific technique for this called the pattern interrupt.
The pattern interrupt. Okay, so the practice prescribed here is to force a physical pause. When that negative urge hits, whether it's the urge to snap defensively in a meeting or to grab that block of cheese at midnight, you're supposed to stop all forward momentum for exactly 5 seconds, a dead stop.
5 seconds of complete physical and behavioral stillness.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because I have to push back on the scale of this solution.
Okay, let's hear it.
We just established that these autopilot loops are physically reinforced neural highways wrapped in myelin, suggesting that a mere 5-second pause can override years of heavy biological construction. Feels a bit like throwing a pebble at a speeding freight train and expecting a derailment.
I get that. It does seem entirely disproportionate, right? Until you look at the latency speeds of the different regions of your brain.
Latency speeds.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to look at where the signal starts. When that Slack notification triggers your anxiety, that signal is originating in the limbic system, specifically the amygdala.
The lizard brain.
Basically. And the amygdala processes threats in milliseconds. It is incredibly fast, but it is not particularly smart. It relies entirely on those pre-paved, automated reflex highways.
While the prefrontal cortex, which, handles executive function, long-term planning, and impulse control, is physically slower to boot up.
Exactly.
The signal takes longer to reach and be processed by the frontal lobe.
So that 5-second pause isn't about, white-knuckling your way through a craving using brute force willpower.
Right.
It is simply about network latency. By forcing a physical halt, you are denying the amygdala the immediate behavioral execution it wants, and you are buying the necessary milliseconds for the prefrontal cortex to finally come online.
So you are literally just waiting for the smart hardware to load the operating system. Once the prefrontal cortex is online, it can look at the situation and say, wait, this is just a routine meeting request. We don't need to trigger a massive cortisol dump. It shifts the electrical signal out of the automated reflex loop and forces a conscious choice.
You interrupt the automated pattern to give yourself the agency of a decision.
I love the mechanics of that. We aren't fighting the habit. We were just manipulating the brain's processing speed to our advantage.
This is a biohack, really.
Yeah, but hitting the brakes avoids the crash. It doesn't actually pave a new road. Once we've used those 5 seconds to let the prefrontal cortex make a new choice, say, choosing to drink a glass of water instead of eating the cheese, how do we ensure that new, fragile little machete path becomes the preferred highway?
Right, because a single trip down a new path doesn't build a highway, and honestly, this is where most habit change efforts just fail.
You just give up.
We move on too quickly. To actually lay the asphalt for a new habit, your brain needs a chemical binding agent. The second technique in the toolkit addresses this perfectly. It's called emotional anchoring.
Emotional anchoring. Because the brain has a highly selective filing system, right? It doesn't consolidate all memories or actions equally. It heavily prioritizes experiences with high emotional stakes or neurochemical rewards.
Which is why the practice of emotional anchoring is so critical. The directive from the text is that when you execute the new positive choice, even something microscopically small, like successfully ignoring your phone for the first 10 minutes of the day, you must stop and actively sit with that feeling of success for 20 to 20 seconds.
You have to intentionally let the dopamine release.
Yes.
We usually think of dopamine just in the context of cheap thrills, like scrolling or eating junk food. But in neuroplasticity, dopamine physically lowers the threshold for neurons to fire together again.
It's the glue.
If I can try an analogy here to ground this chemistry, it feels like emotional anchoring is the biological equivalent of hitting the save button on a massive document.
Oh, I like that. Go on.
Well, if you spend 3 hours typing out a complex, brilliant proposal, but then you just slam your laptop shut without hitting save, the computer dumps the temporary memory.
It's just gone.
You lose the progress. In our daily lives, we rush past our behavioral wins constantly. You finish a grueling workout, you are still catching your breath, and your mind immediately pivots to stressing about the commute or the grocery list.
You didn't save the document.
Exactly. You didn't save it.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. By rushing past the win, you completely deny the brain the neurochemical reward. But when you pause for those 20 seconds to genuinely savor the accomplishment, you are flooding that specific newly fired neural circuit with dopamine.
And that dopamine physically acts on the receptors in those synapses, signaling to the brain, hey, this specific pathway resulted in a high-value reward. Reinforce this connection.
It accelerates Hebbian plasticity.
It drastically speeds up the myelination of that new path. But even with the pattern interrupted and the new choice chemically anchored, there is one final architectural hurdle here.
Right.
You can't just save a document titled "Don't do the thing." Nature abhors a vacuum, and, well, so does your neural network.
Which brings us to the replacement rule. You cannot simply block a highly efficient highway and just leave a void.
Right.
If you just vaguely declare, I'm going to stop stressing about work, you aren't actually giving the brain a new route to process the inevitable stress trigger.
And we culturally overvalue willpower in these scenarios, don't we?
Oh, massively. This raises an important question about how we view self-discipline. Willpower is metabolically expensive. It requires constant, active engagement from the prefrontal cortex to continuously suppress an urge.
Which you can't do forever.
No. Eventually, you will get tired, your blood sugar will drop, your cognitive load will max out, and the prefrontal cortex will just fatigue.
And the second the prefrontal cortex drops its guard, the electrical signal will immediately default to the path of least resistance, the old, fully paved highway.
Which is exactly why you must pre-program a detour. The specific practice here is called if-then planning. You construct the new behavioral bridge before the trigger ever even occurs.
So instead of a massive void like, if I feel overwhelmed at my desk, I will not go outside for a smoke, which just leaves your nervous system stranded with unmet tension, you program a specific execution command.
Give me an example.
Like, if I feel overwhelmed at my desk, then I will complete 2 minutes of physiological sigh breathing.
Yes. It operates exactly like software logic. If trigger X occurs, execute protocol Y.
By doing the if-then planning, you are handing the prefrontal cortex a map in advance.
Exactly.
When the stress hits, the amygdala wants the cigarette, but during that 5-second pattern interrupt pause, the prefrontal cortex comes online and says, wait, we already have a protocol for this specific trigger, routing signal to the breathing exercise.
And every single time you successfully route the signal to the breathing exercise, you are stomping down the dirt on the new path. Follow that up with a 20-second dopamine soak of emotional anchoring, and you are paving the detour. Wow. Meanwhile, the old smoking pathway is sitting completely unused, signaling the microglia to start tearing up the asphalt.
It really is this brilliant closed-loop system for structural biology. First, leverage network latency with the 5-second pattern interrupt. Second, utilize if-then planning to seamlessly route the signal to a new behavior. And third, hit the save button with emotional anchoring to chemically reinforce the new synapse.
It is deeply empowering, but it also requires a pretty sobering level of patience. Remodeling physical tissue is slow.
Yeah.
You are not going to wake up tomorrow with an entirely optimized default mode network just because you successfully paused for 5 seconds today.
The source notes are unflinching about that. Rewiring the mind isn't some glamorous cinematic montage. It is the quiet, often tedious work of consistent microscopic choices.
Very tedious.
It is the boring repetition of laying down one single shovelful of dirt on the new path, day after day.
But the cumulative compounding of those boring repetitions is exactly how you become the architect of your own conscious experience.
To put that architecture into practice, the material leaves us with a highly specific 7-day challenge, and we are passing it directly to you.
I love this part.
The challenge is incredibly narrow. Identify just one single autopilot loop in your daily routine.
Right. Do not attempt to overhaul your entire personality. Just pick one highly specific trigger.
Exactly. It could be the physiological spike when you get cut off in traffic. It could be the mindless habit of opening a new browser tab to check the news the second you hit a difficult problem at work.
Just one loop.
Pick that one loop. For the next 7 days, apply only the pattern interrupt. When the trigger occurs, completely freeze for 5 seconds. Let the prefrontal cortex boot up and actively choose your next movement.
Because every single action you take is a physiological vote for the type of neural network you are building. You are never not rewiring.
Never not rewiring.
The brain is always listening, always optimizing. The only variable is whether you are intentionally guiding the construction crew or if you've handed the blueprints over to your base reflexes.
So what does this all mean? You are never not rewiring. That concept actually leads to a rather alarming thought that wasn't explicitly covered in the brief, but, well, it is the logical endpoint of everything we've just discussed regarding Hebb's law.
Okay, where are we going with this?
Think about the dominant media environment we currently inhabit. If our brains are constantly physically optimizing themselves based on the frequency of our repeated actions, what happens to the physical structure of our attention networks when we spend 2 hours a day mindlessly scrolling through an endless feed of 15-second videos?
Oh, wow. That is a terrifying application of synaptic plasticity.
Right.
If you are consistently consuming hyperfragmented, high dopamine, emotionally erratic microcontent, you're continuously firing the specific neural circuits associated with rapid context switching and the absolute need for instantaneous novelty.
Are we inadvertently paving an 8-lane, super-speed autobahn for severe attention deficit and chronic distraction without ever realizing we're the ones driving the steamroller?
That's a huge concern.
Because if every single swipe of the thumb is a repetition that signals the brain to myelinate that specific pathway, we might be structurally optimizing our own gray matter to be entirely incapable of deep, sustained focus.
By heavily reinforcing that specific loop of constant stimulation, we could be chemically anchoring a permanent state of cognitive unrest.
Wow.
It underscores exactly why understanding these mechanisms isn't just a self-help exercise. It is a vital defense mechanism against an environment explicitly designed to hijack our neurobiology.
We are building the roads whether we intend to or not. So the next time you find yourself standing in the kitchen at midnight staring at the fridge, remember, the hardware inside your skull isn't a finished piece of porcelain. It's wet clay. The only question is, what shape are you choosing to mold it into today?